was this bit of advice that was given to me by a Vermont hill farmer, that if I've done a good job pruning, when I'm done, I should be able to pick up the family cow and throw her between the branches. And this tree has that kind of spacing to it. And the notion here is that sunlight gets into the heart of the tree. That means that the fruiting is not going to just continue to move further and further out. It can have new wood in that canopy section which you've allotted to it. And two, and this is what I really want to emphasize now, it means that after a rain, the wind can get in there and dry things out a lot more readily than it necessarily is going to in the trees behind here. And the fact that they're close means these might stay wet, but you can just get a sense of looking at that tree back there, half of it not in bloom. That dense canopy does not dry out at near the pace that a canopy that's more open does. So here's where we get into understanding disease cycles a little bit more. So when I talk about disease on the fruit tree, there is a primary infection window in the spring, which is really relative to things like apple scab, peach scab, pear scab, cedar apple rust, and a few more fungal type diseases. And then there are some fungal diseases of the summer, and these are mostly the fruit rots and the superficial fungi like sooty blotch and fly speck, which are just feeding on the waxy cuticle of the fruit. And then as well, there are certain bacterial opportunists. So just like we did with insects, in an understanding of fungal progression and what makes for bacterial opportunity, we're going to open some doors to working with having less disease. So what I'm about to talk about all keys very much to what I talked about in terms of plant metabolism and the fungal dominance and nitrogen coming in the ammonium form. I don't want weak, unhealthy trees to use gentler medicines. And so these approaches really correlate to the soil ecosystem. I can't just ignore that. I can't come into an orchard doing an herbicide strip where fungicides have been used for 20, 30 years and expect that neem oil and things like herbal fermented nettle tea are going to make much of a difference. They'll begin to change things, but it's going to take several years to transition that kind of system. So let's key in on apple scab, because that's one that we pretty much share. So its botanical name is Venturia inequalis. This is something I've already explained that overwinters on the fallen leaves. And those leaves that are still there in the spring, as the warmth of the sun accumulates, those spores start to mature. And they're not like instantly ready to go once the snow melts. They have to mature, and it's based on the accumulating warmth of the sun. Similarly, there's that aspect that leaf tissue needs to be 3 to 9 days old. That's the most likely to get infected. And also, when you think about it, target-wise, when the buds first pop on the tree, there's not that much green surface area. Let the tree grow another 2 weeks, 3 weeks. At this point in the year, that canopy totally fills out. So the target zone, so to speak, is much bigger. So the odds increase as we get into the growing season. But then there comes a point where all the spores have matured and they've all been released, and that primary infection window closes. So a lot of these fungal diseases in the spring are going to have a certain launching pad. In the case of apple scab, we're talking about leaves on the orchard floor. If we were talking about pear scab, it would be both the leaves on the orchard floor and twig lesions within the tree itself. That makes pear scab a little more difficult to work with because it has 2 launching pads. These fungal diseases are also going to have a timing aspect that's based partly on tissue being able to be infected and also the fact that eventually it dissipates. And so this kind of information has allowed fruit growers to create spore maturity curves by which I can predict what is the amount of spores that might be released based on so much accumulated warmth of the sun. So this is where I track minimum and maximum temperatures. And in the case of something like scab, it doesn't progress below 32 degrees. So if there's a day in early spring, and let's say it gets up to 60, and it drops to 40 at night. 60 and 40 is 100, divide that by 2. The average temperature that day is 50. This is not something you would do as a home orchardist, but let's just explain it. That 50 minus 32, which is the threshold temperature where scab develops, means that there were 18 degree days on that day. So I track degree days as the season progresses from the point that first green tissue shows. And at around 300 degree days to 800 degree days, all those factors I've just spoken about, young tissue, amount of surface area, more mature spores, come into play. And that's what's called the primary infection window. And that's pretty much from the point of pink to about a week after petal fall. So now we're back to what's relevant to you as a home orchardist, that point of pink to a week after petal fall. And one of the analogies I like to use here is this. I'm going to be doing two principal things in holistic disease management. One is how can I enhance the immune function of the tree, and the other is how can I renew that competitive colonization. So when I gave that example of the chestnut tree and talked about the mud packs into the lesions, I want to do a similar thing on the surface of my leaves. Here's my analogy. Sometimes when I give these talks, it isn't as easy as driving an hour and a half south from northern New Hampshire, but it's driving to Manchester, getting on an airplane and going to Wisconsin or California or what have you. And when I do that, I am getting into an ecosystem where there is bound to be all kinds of potential germs, because I'm breathing the same air with 400 other human beings, and we didn't all come from pristine northern New Hampshire necessarily. And similarly, our trees have this point in the spring where they're literally getting on an airplane, so to speak, in that there's a much more of a disease possibility. So when I get on that plane as a single biological organism, I may have just had a great week going into it. I've been eating whole grains and lots of vegetables and fruits and free-range eggs. My diet is good. I may have had a week where I'm getting 8 hours of sleep a night and I'm not waking up at 1 in the morning to think about all I'm going to do for the next 30 years. I may have had a week where my wife Nancy and I are openly and fully communicating. You know who that's due to. But I may have had a week where my teenage daughter Gracie, 17 years old, is honoring and respecting everything I say as her father. I may have had a week where I've met all my deadlines for Chelsea Green Publishing and whoever else I'm working for. So my stress levels are low. I'm a healthy being. I'm a tree in a fungal-dominated ecosystem, everything we talked about this morning. And yet, I get into that ecosystem when there's potential, much more potential. So one of the things that I do is I take echinacea tincture before I get on the plane, when I land, take it a couple times after, just because I want to boost that immune function of my body. Similarly, when the trees get on the airplane in the spring, I want to boost their immune function. So I'm going to use that as part of my approach. Another part of this is the fact that I am sitting here in front of you, not just me, one person, but I'm a community of 1 trillion. And my eyeballs are covered with bacteria. My skin is just laced, reeking with all kinds of microbes. My respiratory tract, my digestive tract, all sorts of microbes in there that are helping me be healthy. And without those good guys, those ally associations, I would be a sitting duck for disease. So when I talked about the mud pack on the chestnut tree, there are ways that I can renew the canopy colonization on the surface of the plant. So now we have to understand what happens when that fungal disease spore lands on the leaf. It rains. The mere fact that the ground gets wet, there's 1/10 of an inch of rain or more, means that whatever spores are mature at that point are popped and released by the tens of thousands, and they're going to land on the surface of the tree. And if it stays wet long enough, like at 50 hours or at 50 degrees, it requires 11 hours of wetting, then that fungal spore is going to have enough time to send out a hyphae to penetrate into the leaf cell to access food resources, and that's what is actually an infection. And that spore from there goes on to create what we call scab, the black spotting of the leaf and the fruit of the apple. And if things dry out too soon for that event to happen, then there's no infection. So there will be years where there's hardly any black spot on the wild apples. And it isn't because those trees are like genetically immune to this disease. It's more about the type of season we've had. So this year, we've had about 2.5+ weeks of really perfect sunny weather, and it didn't rain. Well, in my mind, that perfect sunny weather represented a time when spores were maturing, but not getting released. And about a week plus ago, we finally had a Saturday where we had an inch of rain. That inch of rain, preceded by that amount of warm, dry spells where spores matured, that told me that was a major release event on that particular Saturday. Now that was the point of between 1/4 inch green and true pink. And so my spray schedule, we're going to talk about spraying the week of 1/4 inch green and spraying it pink, is one that would accommodate that wetting event. I'm going to do stuff to boost the immune function of my tree. At the same time, I'm going to re-enhance that competitive colonization. And we're continuing right now in the midst of that primary infection window. We've had a couple misty showers, but no real release since that inch of rain. And right now it's at bloom. I'd rather not spray during bloom. If I do spray, I'm going to not put the fats out there. I'm not going to put neem oil because neem would have an impact on pollinators. But I also kind of know that in another couple days there's going to be a big release event. The weather people are talking about rain on like Tuesday, Wednesday, I think. So ideally, on Monday or Tuesday morning, I am going to do what I call my petal fall spray. And in some senses it will be early, and if too much bloom is open, I'll just skip the neem oil for the reason I said. But when I'm making my holistic sprays, this is a mixture of seaweed, liquid fish, effective microbes, and the pure neem oil. So with the neem, I'm getting 2 more aspects in addition to those azurdiractins that inhibit the molting cycle of insects. One is that neem is very rich in terpenoids. So when I spray a terpenoid-rich herb on a fruit tree or a fruiting bush, that in turn stimulates that tree or bush to produce more terpenoids itself. And that's part of the immune function of a plant. So when that spore landed on the leaf and sent out that hyphae to penetrate that cell, it creates certain enzymes. And the plant senses those enzymes. And it responds through an oxidative burst. So sometimes people talk about using hydrogen peroxide to work with disease organisms. We're just mimicking what nature does. That oxidative burst, in turn, in the plant leaf, causes it to build up levels of salicylic acid. So that's something that a lot of plants create. And as an herbalist, I know one remedy if I have a headache is to chew on a willow twig, because willow is very high in salicylic acid. And there's actually a spray product you can buy called Actigard, which is synthesized salicylic acid, again trying to induce the plant to do more of this process. From there, the plant goes on to create those phytoalexin compounds, the terpenoids and the flavonoids, what I'm using the neem to reproduce. And this is at the heart of the immune function. And one good way of thinking about it is it just gives the leaf or the fruitlet more resistance time. So now, rather than 11 hours at 50 degrees, and no one's really figured this out, but it takes more time. It has to stay moist longer because the plant is resisting the ability of that fungal hyphae to get into its cell. And maybe that amount of time is just a few hours. Maybe it's another 10 hours. But now you can start recognizing how if I have that kind of tree with that kind of oomph within, the likelihood of it drying out soon enough gets better and better because the plant can outlast the disease organism. So between competitive colonization, getting that colonization on the order of 70% or more, and boosting the immune function, that's how I've broken away from using sulfur and fungicides. And for home orchardists, it's very, very simple. There's 4 sprays, 1/4 inch green, and at pink, and at petal fall, and at first cover, which is 7 days later. I kind of fine-tune that a little to the weather events as they happen, and I might spray during bloom because sometimes the bloom period's extended and I don't use the neem. But we can either keep it simple or we can get into it being a little bit more nuanced. If you're dealing with cedar apple rust, does eastern red cedar grow in Plymouth? I don't really remember it. You have to get into southern New Hampshire. So Luckily, up here we're not. But some of you are from down in Massachusetts, and you probably are dealing with cedar apple rust. And it is something that primary infection window continues about a week longer than scab. So if that's your issue, you have to recognize, okay, I'm dealing with this disease. The timing of what I need to do is extend it a little bit more. So that's what I mean by fungal progression. You have to know what is it I'm dealing with so that I understand the timing. And I can average it out for home orchardists, but as a commercial grower, I go a little bit further with it. That idea of colonization, when I talk about me being a community of 1 trillion and my eyeballs, etc., covered with bacteria, well, I'm a warm, moist environment. Out here, it's not always that way. There are drought periods, there's high heat, there's ultraviolet light, there's acid rain. These are things that deplete colonization. And depending on my agricultural choices, especially the use of fungicides, I also deplete competitive colonization. And another thing is that sometimes the food resources to support the soil food web arising, I call this the arboreal food web. It's the same kind of organisms. It's fungi, it's single-celled fungi, the yeasts, it's bacteria. There's actually nematodes and protozoa that exist up there. The whole thing about microbe eating microbe, part of the process of a plant absorbing foliar nutrition, it's based on the microbes. We don't often think that way. But anyway, the point is, it runs out. So how can I renew it? So the thing that I'm using, some people use compost tea, and I support that highly. But it's a bit more involved for a home orchardist to know how to do that properly. And to really understand it, you need a light microscope, and you have to understand, is this a fungal tea or is this a bacterial tea? And you can't just assume it. What I use is something that came out of the natural farming movement in Japan. It's called effective microorganisms. I use the term effective microbes so I don't violate a particular someone's trademark. But effective microbes are a mix of 3 particular groupings of species. One is photosynthetic bacteria, which have the ability to synthesize food from the air, so they're very important in that food resource link. Another are different lactic acid bacteria. This is what you find in pickles and sauerkraut. Lactic acid is very important in the decomposition of organic matter. It's also something that helps translocate to move nutrition. So when we talk about the need for calcium in the leaf and in the fruit, lactic acid bacteria play a role in that. And then it's just also the mere fact of numbers. You know, when I get these microbes up there, I get colonization up to 70%. And disease organisms typically cannot relate to that kind of crowd. They depend on things getting depleted. That's part of how an infection comes about. And finally, there's a number of species of yeasts in there. And yeasts are, anyone who's made cider and let it sit and has seen it ferment, well, that's just telling you yeasts are already there. We're just supplementing their numbers. So when I make this mix with the fish, the seaweed, the pure neem oil, and the effective microbes, I'm working on all these different fronts. I'm providing foods. That's what the fatty acids are for. When I say the word fish or liquid fish, you have to understand the nuance of that. I did not just say fish emulsion. I said liquid fish or fish hydrolysate. And what I'm talking about here is unpasteurized fish products. So fish emulsion is made from fish where the oily portion has been removed, and that might be the oil, fish oil you see in the health food store, what have you. And the fish itself is cooked as part of the process to emulsify it and lock in those nutrients and make sure there's no smell. That's useful for putting nitrogen on lettuce seedlings in the greenhouse, but it doesn't have the fats. It doesn't have the biological activity that I want. So liquid fish is more and more common. There are certain companies that make it correctly, by which I mean cold process, that you don't lose the biological activity. So products like Neptune's Harvest or Organic Gem or Dram or Schaefer's Freshwater Fishery, that's what I'm talking about. Unpasteurized, cold processed fish. And for some, you know, you give these talks and you can encounter many questions. And once I was asked, well, what if I don't want to grow?
Like a fish?
No, the smell thing I can talk about. But what if I don't want to grow meat-fed apples? And I thought,
I'm a vegetarian.
Or the vegan yard question. So for those people, again, thinking herbally, what interests me in those fish? I'm not going to necessarily get the nitrogen if I don't use the fish, but it was those fatty oils. And I'm talking about palmitic oil, linoleic oil. There's a whole bunch of them. Neem has this as well. Well, one substitute that comes to mind would be coconut milk. They use coconut oil products in Europe to work with summer diseases. So you can substitute. It's when you start to play with herbal medicine and holistic, it's really about the nutrition. And what is it that's in those products that I'm using? I like liquid fish because I'm not that far from the ocean, relatively speaking. And now the question of essence. So,
I tried to track down, after Crockers seemed to be unavailable, I talked to people at Crockers. Then they said, well, the people at Fedco, they couldn't get through to them. Anyway, I looked at Neptune's Harvest and the other things, and it wasn't clear to me I couldn't drill into that to find out actually, was that in fact the
Crocker's fish oil is not what I'm talking about.
Huh?
Crocker's fish oil is a refined fish oil. It's more like a shellac.
So you've moved on from Crockers to Neptune.
That was 20 years ago, Kevin.
I know I'm always out of date. Okay, so but the stuff that you're using now is not cooked. It's not pasteurized.
Correct.
And
Neptune's Harvest is such a product.
Okay.
Fedco is finally carrying such a type of fish. They were carrying just fish emulsion up till this year.
They're now carrying Fedco's because okay.
They have fish hydrolysate.
Fish hydrolysate.
That word hydrolysate implies cold processed fish.
So if I talk to Fedco, if I can get someone on the phone at Fedco and say fish hydrolysate.
I'm not going to guarantee that.
No, but where do you get it? No, I know, that's too optimistic. Where do you get it? Can you make it?
I buy direct from Organic Gem, which is out of Gloucester, Massachusetts, and I get a barrel full. Okay. I get 2 barrels full because that's 2 years worth for me, and it keeps 2 years.
It keeps 2 years.
So I'm saving on the shipping.
I probably wouldn't use a barrel. Okay.
No.
I've used the Organic Gem. I used Organic Gem in turf management for quite a while, and we saw some pretty amazing things.
And that's good to bring that up in turf management. So I'm talking about fruit trees, but you know how in these last few years one of the big concerns for growing tomatoes or potatoes has been late blight, and out of the organic extension recommendation circle has come the advice that, well, you spray copper, you maybe spray a lot of copper, and if that doesn't work, you pull the plant up. So copper is an organic material. It's an organic mineral fungicide. It works a lot like you're walking down the street and someone drops a piano on you from 6 stories above. Copper just flattens everything. It has a really harsh impact on microbes and earthworms. So that wasn't really much of a solution, was it? Okay, you got late blight, spray copper, and once you know it doesn't work, pull the plants up, you've lost your crop. I was spraying the holistic sprays because everything I talk about potatoes have an immune function. They have a phytochemistry to resist disease. We can enhance that. Potatoes that are covered with competitive colonization have the ability, not in themselves, but through their allies, to thwart disease. So this is applicable as well in the garden. I spray my garlic. I spray places where I've just turned a cover crop and I'm prepping ground for planting. Those lactic acid bacteria, it's going to just enhance the decomposition action. It's not a silver bullet per se, but it's something that has much more use than you think. And
so something like EM might help with late blight.
Totally, because that's competitive colonization, EM being effective microbes. But you said something about the smell of the fish. You know, when you really get into this, and maybe this is why I do all this, between the liquid fish, and particularly when I make the fermented nettle tea and the horsetail tea, which smells a little like sulfured eggs, and then the neem oil, which has a nutty, garlicky oil, but some people don't like the smell of that either. After I spray and I go into town, it's really interesting in terms of the reaction. And for me, it's always been about the ultimate male essence. You know, I'm working on it and I'm fine tuning it, and it's getting better and better. But that's why I always sit a certain distance. So here I am dealing with diseases in that primary infection window. Now, some diseases, things like peach leaf curl or bacterial spot, if you're growing stone fruits, things shift a little bit. They're not overwintering on leaves on the ground. These are disease organisms that are overwintering in the bud scales. So when the leaves come off the peach tree after harvest, the bud scale is more open. So the conventional organic way is to spray copper at that point, and this is in early fall, to get that piano falling on overwintering inoculant. My way is to come in with double rates of the neem and the fish and use the fatty acids to help start dissolve that lipid coating that those pathogens protect themselves for the winter, and follow that up within 24 hours with effective microbes to consume them. So I break down their defense. So again, as a home orchardist, would you do that? Probably not. There are peach leaf resistant, peach curl resistant varieties that you might plant. But as a commercial grower, there's holistic alternatives, but it still comes down to you have to understand a little bit more about the disease. So let's move on to the summer rots and things like sooty blotch and fly speck. These are things that before they get into the fruit, the flesh of the fruit, in the case of rots, they have to establish themselves on the waxy cuticle of the fruit. So in the case of brown rot, which is kind of the typical disease that most people are going to encounter if you're growing cherries or peaches, brown rot is something that at bloom time afflicts the flowers, and some of the flowers on the tree will brown. So my holistic spray program is kind of helping with that. But where that affliction takes place, cankers are formed on the stem of the leaves, and it's from those cankers that new spores are going to come when the fruit starts to ripen, and that's where the rot comes in the case of brown rot on peaches and cherries. So during the summer months, for me to deal with that, I have gotten into doing fermented herbal teas. And here, it's through the biological breakdown of the constituents in things like stinging nettle and horsetail that I boost the silica levels of the cuticle, and I have a fruit more resistant to rot, more able to thwart cuticle feeding organisms like sooty blotch and fly speck. So for those of you who know the stinging nettle plant, you walk by, and if you're not paying attention and you brush against it, you get stung. And nettle is like one of the greatest greens in early spring to make greens from, or to dry it for tea, because it's so rich in all kinds of constituents. But when nettle goes to seed, the levels of silica in it go skyrocketing up. There's another plant, horsetail. Last night at Plymouth, outside in their beautiful landscape beds, it almost looked like they did it deliberately, was this huge patch of horsetail. And horsetail is a plant that goes back to the times of the dinosaurs. It got as tall as 200 feet. All of us driving in automobiles today have a relationship with horsetail because a lot of the petroleum is really horsetail derived. That was one of the primary plants growing in that time period. And today's horsetail is much humbler, more like 14, 16 inches tall. And when it first comes up, the first part that comes up looks almost like a mushroom. That's the male part that's going to sporulate. Horsetail kind of straddles the divide between plant and fungus. And when horsetail first comes up, the fronds are vertical. That's when we gather it for an herbal medicine. And there's lots of uses that horsetail plays, and it's partly it's silica. But when horsetail, the fronds start to flatten, and that's why we call it horsetail. Some people think that looks more like a horsetail. That's when its silica levels rise. And both of those, with the nettle and horsetail, that's happening about a week or two just beyond now, just when I enter the summer fungal disease period. So when I make an herbal tea, I am filling a bucket with either one of those plants. Well, I usually make a bucket of each for every 100 gallons of spray. There's no official dose here. And I take it to the back porch and I pour a few quarts of boiled water on top to start to break it down, and then just top up the buckets with cold water. And I let it sit for 7 to 9 days. So my summer spray schedule becomes a little more spread out. Like right now, my holistic sprays after bloom are going to be a week apart. But I'm going to eventually move it to more like 14 days. So as a home orchardist, you may not do this. You may be totally have no issue with sooty blotch, fly speck, and rot's not an issue for you. However, if you're growing peaches and a lot of them are rotting, keep paying attention right now. So these teas, through the fermentation process, those nutrients become more bioavailable for uptake. So those then get added to my summer holistic sprays. And I'm spraying basically the same thing, the neem oil, the seaweed, and the effective microbes, but I'm no longer using the fish as I get more into the summer because I don't want that nitrogen component. But now I'm boosting the silica levels, but I'm doing it with plants that grow in my ecosystem, so I really like that. Another tea I make is that of comfrey, because comfrey is very good at accumulating calcium. So this is a calcium-rich tea, and certain apples, Honeycrisp particularly comes to mind, have calcium deficiencies. Even if there's enough calcium in the soil, these are plants that don't necessarily translocate enough calcium. And another thing at the same time that's kind of cool to understand, just about herbal medicine, I also grow a lot of hardneck garlic. And one of the things you do with garlic is there's a scape. And if you let that scape fully develop, some of the energy won't go into the bulb. So when the scape comes out of the curl, we cut off those scapes. And you can only make so much garlic pesto. You can only give the sheep so much garlic scapes to deal with worms. You don't want to give it to the cows if you're milking them, because then it becomes garlic milk. But anyway, I take handfuls of these scapes, and this is about the same time period, early June, mid-June, that I'm taking the scapes off. And garlic is something that really helps move nutrients through a membrane. So when you're an herbal parent, one of the things you know is that if your little infant gets really a bad flu and is really congested, as an adult, it's very easy to eat lots of garlic and get that expectorant action, because garlic is good at helping to clear the lung. But with a toddler, there's no way to get them to eat garlic. So cutting a clove and rubbing it into the base of their foot, within a few seconds, you'll actually smell the garlic coming out of the pores up here. So garlic's just demonstrating its ability, the organosulfur compounds in garlic, to move nutrients through a membrane. So I put garlic scapes in my teas because I'm going to be able to get more of that silica and more of the green energy of nettle into the plant. I didn't know you had a plug-in tree. Then there is the bacteria. So now it shifts a little bit. Bacteria totally rely on an opportunity to get into the plant. And the main bacterial disease that some of you may face would be fire blight. Has anyone ever seen fire blight? Fire blight is going to strike pears in particular, but it also strikes apples. It gets into fire blight only gets into the tree because there's an opportunity. And the primary opportunity is this. Fire blight is out there, but it doesn't have an opening. It's waiting. And when the temperatures get into the 80s and there's some sort of moisture for the bacteria to move from its harboring sites on the bark crevices, one opening is every time a blossom opens. That's a doorway into the vascular system of the tree. Another opening is during this month of from bloom on for about 6 weeks, if we have a bad hailstorm and there's all these tears made in the bark, those are openings to the vascular system of the tree. Another opening is if you're just so excited about pruning and you didn't get it all done and you wait till it's in the 80s and it's moist out and you're pruning after bloom, you're making openings into the vascular system of the tree. Sometimes it's just the fact that strong winds tear the ends of leaves, or sometimes it's aphids or leafhoppers chewing on shoots, tender shoots, and they become openings into the vascular system of the tree. That's usually the vector where you see that shoot that blackens and turns over. So what to do about bacteria? Well, when that flower opens, it's not colonized yet because it's just now freshly revealed to the world. And when I spray those effective microbes, that becomes competitive colonization. And bacteria have no tolerance of any kind of competition. They rely on an opportunity that there's no one else crowding the inn. So fire blight, as much as we have made a big deal of it in this last round of talking about organic certification rules and the need to allow the continued use of antibiotics, nature actually has been telling us for a long time, competition works really well. I first encountered this with research done in Utah, and they took a benign bacterium and they put it in the entranceway of beehives. And every time the honeybees came and went, they'd crawl through this bacterium powder with Pseudomonas. And they would deliver the Pseudomonas to every flower they went to. And now that flower was colonized. And that took care of fire blight, because fire blight so much depends on that opportunity to be open. So if during bloom it gets into the 80s and it's moist, it's humid, and we don't see that as much up here as you do in the mid-Atlantic and further south, well, that's when I do bloom boost sprays, and it's mostly effective microbes and seaweed. I'm not spraying the fatty acids. I don't want to clog the flowers with fats. I also don't want to impact the pollinators with neem, even though I'm using a very little amount. There's no reason for me to knock back pollinator populations, because they're insects. They're going through a molting cycle as well. So all this information and all those glazed eyeballs I see in front of me, how do we process it? How do we make this work for what I'm doing? So for my approach to this is there's an orchard calendar, and it's tied to what you see, and it's tied to what you know has happened at your orchard. You know, the more that you can be proactive, that's helpful. So that takes a year or 2 or 3 to come up to speed with what's going on. You start to whittle down that compendium I have in the back. If you're not growing peaches, none of that's relative to you. If borer is not at your place, you've looked for it, you haven't seen the frass, you haven't lost any trees, you don't do those botanical trunk sprays. And now the list starts to get smaller. And within the context of that list, there's an understanding that, okay, I really want to grow good apples. I've been having a problem with scab. I recognize that 1/4 inch green, pink, petal fall, and first cover are really important. So now you cancel the trip to Europe. You no longer play golf during that time of the year. You're just totally focused on your fruit trees, because you know that's really a high priority. And the fall holistic spray, the leaf decomposition, that's a really important time too, because if we're out here and none of that has been managed and there's so much more inoculum, we're talking a scale of 100 times more pressure. Whereas if we've worked with the biology to lessen that, it's much more doable. So you have to take this information and go home and think about, okay, what am I dealing with? What's tolerable? What's not? Recognize how these many threads weave together nutritionally in terms of the feeder roots, in terms of the soil food web, the arboreal food web. All that together is what makes holistic fruit growing possible.